A shadow moves in the cellar. Secrets wait in every corner. Welcome to the Silent Clueworks. I am your host, Echo of Silence. Drop a comment and tell me where you're joining this mystery from. Your words make this journey unforgettable. I love reading everyone. Let's dive in. It was a Tuesday in October when the bourbon came to call, and if I had known then what I know now about rare whiskey and the people who covet it, I might have pretended nobody was home. But hindsight is a luxury reserved for men who don't have to pay the bills, and our bank balance that week was running about as thin as the patience of a man trying to explain compound interest to a houseplant. So when the doorbell rang at 20 minutes past 3, I got up from my desk where I had been pretending to organize the orchid expense records and went to see what fortune had delivered to our doorstep. The woman standing on the stoop looked like money, but not the kind that comes easy or goes quietly. She was somewhere in her 30s, with dark hair cut in a sharp line at her jaw, and eyes that were either green or gray, depending on whether she was measuring you or deciding whether you were worth the trouble. She wore a charcoal wool coat that had been tailored by someone who charged by the hour, and she carried a leather case that looked both expensive and important. More interesting than her appearance, however, was the smell that accompanied her, a rich, complex aroma that spoke of charred oak and aged grain, and the kind of patience that turns corn mash into liquid gold. I introduced myself and asked what I could do for her. She said her name was Catherine Marsh and that she needed to speak with Nero Wolfe about a matter involving theft, forgery, and what she called a violation of trust that went deeper than money. I told her that Wolfe was upstairs with his orchids until 6 o'clock and would not see anyone before then, but that if she cared to explain her business, I would present it to him and see if he was interested. She looked past me into the hall, seemed to weigh something in her mind, and then said she would prefer to discuss it with Wolfe directly, but understood that some explanation was necessary. I invited her into the office, took her coat, and offered her the red leather chair. She sat with the case across her knees and declined my offer of refreshment. Then she told me her story. And it was the kind of story that makes a man glad he chose a profession where the surprises come with paychecks attached. Catherine Marsh, it turned out, owned a small but prestigious auction house that specialized in rare spirits and vintage wines. She had built her reputation over 15 years by being both knowledgeable and scrupulously honest, two qualities that do not always coexist in the auction business. 3 weeks ago, she had been approached by a collector who wanted to consign a bottle of pre-prohibition bourbon for sale. The bottle was supposedly from a legendary distillery that had been destroyed by fire in 1918, making any surviving bottles extraordinarily valuable. The collector provided documentation that appeared authentic, and Marsh had accepted the consignment for her next auction. The trouble began when she decided to have the bottle independently authenticated. She sent photographs and documentation to 3 different experts, and 2 of them immediately declared it genuine. The third expert, however, was Dr. Samuel Brennan, a professor of chemistry at Columbia who specialized in the analysis of aged spirits. Brennan examined the bottle in person and declared it to be a masterful forgery. Not just the label or the seal, but the contents as well. Someone had created a chemical cocktail that mimicked the taste and appearance of century-old bourbon, complete with the proper color, viscosity, and even the correct pattern of sediment. That discovery led to an uncomfortable conversation with the consignor, a man named Vincent Torres, who claimed to have inherited the bottle from his grandfather. Torres became agitated when confronted with the authentication results and demanded the return of his property. When Marsh refused, citing the need for further investigation, Torres threatened legal action. 2 days later, someone broke into her gallery after hours and stole the bottle from her vault. But the theft was not the end of the matter. Yesterday morning, Marsh had received a telephone call from a man who claimed to have information about the forgery operation. The caller said he had evidence that Torres was part of a sophisticated network that was flooding the market with fake rare spirits, and that the bottle stolen from her gallery was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The caller wanted to meet with her, but only if she brought along someone with the reputation and resources to properly investigate the matter. He had specifically mentioned Nero Wolfe by name. I asked her if she had any idea who the caller was, and she said she did not, but that his voice suggested education and his knowledge of the forgery suggested expertise. I asked her what was in the case she carried, and she opened it to reveal a second bottle, identical to the one that had been stolen. She explained that when she had first examined the consigned bottle, she had noticed certain irregularities that prompted her to do some research. That research had led her to acquire this bottle from a private collector in Kentucky, a bottle that she was confident was genuine and could serve as a comparison standard. I told her I would present her case to Wolfe and asked her to return at 6:15. After she left, I went back to my desk and tried to concentrate on the orchid records, but my mind kept returning to the rich aroma that had accompanied her and the implications of her story. A forgery operation sophisticated enough to fool experts suggested resources and connections that went well beyond the usual run of con artists and petty criminal. And the fact that someone had specifically requested Wolfe's involvement suggested that we were being drawn into something that had already been carefully planned. At 6 o'clock, I went upstairs to the plant rooms to brief Wolfe on our visitor. I found him in the warm room, standing before a bench of cattleyas with the expression of profound contentment that orchids always brought to his face. I waited until he turned toward me, and then I told him about Catherine Marsh and her problem with forged bourbon. Wolfe listened without interruption, his eyes half closed in concentration. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, and I could see him turning the problem over in his mind like a jeweler examining a stone for flaws. Finally, he opened his eyes and looked at me with the expression that meant he had found something interesting enough to pursue. He told me to inform Miss Marsh that he would see her at 6:15 and to ask Fritz to prepare for the possibility of a guest at dinner tomorrow evening. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that I should also ask Fritz to check the inventory in our own wine cellar. When I asked him why, he said that men who forge rare spirits rarely limit themselves to a single target, and that it would be prudent to ensure that our own collection had not been tampered with. I went back downstairs to call Catherine Marsh, but I was thinking about Wolfe's final comment and wondering if we were about to discover that the case had already come closer to home than any of us had realized. At 6:15 on the nose, Catherine Marsh returned to our doorstep with the punctuality of a Swiss chronometer, which told me something useful about her character. People who arrive exactly on time are usually either compulsively organized or deeply anxious, and in the detective business, both traits can be equally revealing. I escorted her to the office, where Wolfe had already assumed his position behind the desk, having descended from the plant rooms with his usual measured deliberation. The evening light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rug, and the air held that particular quality of anticipation that precedes either revelation or disappointment. Wolfe greeted her with the slightest inclination of his head and gestured toward the red leather chair. She sat with the leather case positioned carefully beside her feet and waited for him to begin. There are clients who fidget, clients who chatter, and clients who demand immediate action, but Catherine Marsh possessed the rare quality of patience, which suggested either exceptional self-control or the kind of desperation that has moved beyond panic into resignation. Wolfe studied her for a moment with the expression he reserves for new specimens, cataloguing everything from the set of her shoulders to the quality of her gloves. Then he asked her to repeat the story she had told me earlier, explaining that he preferred to hear such matters directly rather than through intermediaries, no matter how reliable those intermediaries might consider themselves to be. She complied without hesitation, and I noticed that her second telling was almost identical to the first, which indicated either an excellent memory or careful rehearsal, both of which were points in her favor. When she finished, Wolfe leaned back in his chair and placed his palms flat on the desktop. He asked her why she had not simply returned the bottle to Torres and washed her hands of the entire affair, thereby avoiding the unpleasantness of theft, threats, and mysterious telephone calls. She replied that her reputation depended entirely on maintaining the highest standards of authentication, and that allowing a known forgery to enter the market under her gallery's imprimatur would constitute professional suicide of the most public and irreversible kind. More than that, she continued, the existence of such sophisticated forgeries threatened the integrity of the entire rare spirits market, and if she failed to take action now, the problem would metastasize beyond any hope of containment. Her clients were not merely wealthy collectors, but institutions, museums, and investors who trusted her expertise to protect them from precisely this kind of fraud. To betray that trust, even passively, would destroy not only her business, but her ability to sleep peacefully for the remainder of her natural life. Wolfe asked her about Vincent Torres, and she provided details that painted a picture of a man who was either extraordinarily lucky or extraordinarily careful. Torres was in his mid-40s, well-dressed, articulate, and apparently possessed of considerable wealth, though the sources of that wealth remained somewhat opaque. He had first approached her gallery 6 months ago with a collection of rare Armagnacs that had proven both genuine and profitable. Since then, he had consigned several other items, always with impeccable documentation and always with results that enhanced both their reputations. The documentation for the stolen bourbon had included photographs of the original purchase by Torres's grandfather in 1917, a handwritten receipt from the distillery, and a letter from a noted historian confirming the authenticity of the papers. She had conducted her own research into the distillery's records and found nothing to contradict Torres's claims, which was why she had accepted the consignment with confidence rather than suspicion. But there was another player in this drama, she continued, one she had not mentioned during our earlier conversation. Her business partner, Leo Garrison, had been instrumental in building the gallery's reputation and client base. They had founded Marsh & Garrison together 15 years ago, with Catherine handling acquisitions and authentication, while Leo managed finances, client relationships, and publicity. They shared everything that mattered to the business, including access to the vault, where valuable items were stored pending sale. When she told Leo about Dr. Brennan's report declaring the bourbon a forgery, his reaction had been immediate and emphatic. He wanted her to return the bottle to Torres without delay, avoid any public discussion of the authentication issues, and focus on protecting the gallery's reputation rather than pursuing abstract principles of market integrity. They had argued, with Leo pointing out that their insurance would not cover losses resulting from what he called unnecessary confrontation with litigious clients. Wolfe asked whether Leo had known about the change in the vault combination, and Catherine admitted that she had informed him of the change while they were arguing about how to handle the Torres situation. She had been angry and had told him that she was not taking any chances with the bottle's security until the matter was resolved. Leo had not been pleased with either the decision or the implication that she no longer trusted his judgment completely. The anonymous caller had contacted her again that morning, she continued, providing additional details that made the situation both more urgent and more dangerous. The caller had identified himself only as someone who had recently severed his connection with what he called the organization, and who possessed detailed knowledge of their methods, targets, and future plans. He claimed that Torres was merely one operative in a network that had been placing sophisticated forgeries in the market for at least 3 years, and that Catherine's gallery was only one of several that had been targeted for infiltration. The caller had been specific about the meeting arrangements, insisting that it take place at a bar called the Dark Cellar on East 47th Street at 10 o'clock the following evening. He had asked her to bring Nero Wolfe's eyes and ears, using those exact words, which suggested not only familiarity with Wolfe's reputation, but also advanced knowledge that she would consult him about the matter. Wolfe sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, his eyes closed and his lips moving in the barely perceptible rhythm that indicated intensive mental activity. When he opened his eyes, he told Catherine that he would accept the case, subject to his standard fee arrangements and the understanding that he would conduct the investigation according to his own methods and timeline. She agreed immediately, and we settled the financial details with the efficiency of people who understand that time is often more valuable than money. After Catherine left, I secured the genuine bottle she had brought in our safe and returned to the office, where Wolfe remained seated with an expression of deep concentration. I asked him what he thought of her story, and he replied that it possessed the virtue of being either completely truthful or completely fabricated, with no comfortable middle ground available for those who preferred ambiguity to commitment. Before I could ask him to elaborate on that observation, Fritz appeared in the doorway with an expression that I had learned to associate with household emergencies of the sort that Wolfe took very personally indeed. Fritz apologized for the interruption, but said that he had been conducting the inventory of the wine cellar that Wolfe had requested, and that he had discovered something that required immediate attention. 2 bottles were missing from the lower shelves where the pre-prohibition American whiskeys were stored. Bottles that had definitely been present during Fritz's last complete inventory 3 weeks earlier. More disturbing still, Fritz had found evidence that someone had been in the cellar recently, including footprints in the dust that did not match any shoes worn by the household's regular occupants. Wolfe's face darkened with an expression I had seen only a handful of times in our long association, the look of a man whose personal sanctuary has been violated by strangers with unknown intentions. He told Fritz to secure the cellar immediately and to prepare a complete written inventory of everything that remained. Then he looked at me with eyes that had gone from interested to dangerous. The case, he said, had just acquired a personal dimension that elevated it from professional curiosity to family business, and family business, as I well knew, was the kind that Nero Wolfe never left unfinished. The violations of Wolfe's cellar had transformed the atmosphere in the brownstone from professional interest to personal vendetta, and I have learned over the years that there are few things more dangerous than Nero Wolfe when someone has invaded his private sanctuary. He sat behind his desk like a mountain contemplating an avalanche. His eyes reduced to slits and his massive hands folded with the kind of stillness that precedes either profound thought or explosive action. He instructed me to accompany Fritz back to the cellar for a thorough examination of the crime scene, and I could tell from his tone that he expected results, not excuses. The cellar occupied the full basement of the brownstone, with stone walls that had been there since the building's construction and climate control systems that Wolfe had installed at considerable expense. Fritz led me to the American whiskey section with the solemnity of a man showing me a grave, and I could see immediately why the theft had struck him so personally. The missing bottles had left 2 conspicuous gaps on the 3rd shelf, outlined by dust patterns that testified to years of careful storage. I examined the footprints that Fritz had discovered, using a flashlight to study the impressions in the thin layer of dust near the back wall. The prints were narrow, suggesting a size 8 or 9 shoe, with a tread pattern that indicated dress shoes rather than work boots. More telling was the path they traced, straight from the stairs to the whiskey section and back again, with no deviation or exploration. Whoever had entered the cellar had known exactly what they wanted and where to find it. The lock on the service entrance told a more sophisticated story. Under magnification, I found 2 microscopic scratches on the bottom of the keyway, the signature of someone who had used professional tools with surgical precision. This was not the work of an opportunistic burglar, but of someone with both skill and specific objectives. I reported these findings to Wolfe, adding that the intruder had likely struck during the narrow window when both Fritz and I had been away from the brownstone on Tuesday afternoon. Wolfe received this information with a grim nod and told me to sit down with my notebook. We were going to construct what he called a roster of malefactors, a systematic catalogue of everyone who possessed the motive, means, and audacity to challenge him in his own domain. The exercise would serve as our battle plan for the campaign ahead, and he wanted the enemy clearly identified before I ventured into hostile territory. Vincent Torres headed the list, naturally enough. The man had demonstrated a willingness to use theft and intimidation when crossed, and if he was part of a larger organization, as the anonymous caller suggested, he would have access to the kind of professional talent that could bypass our security. The theft from our cellar might be intended as a warning, a message that no one was beyond their reach. Leo Garrison earned the second position through partnership dynamics and financial desperation. Wolfe pointed out that business partners often harbor resentments that fester until they explode, and Garrison had been notably eager to avoid scandal. If he was involved in the forgery operation, either willingly or through coercion, Catherine's crusade would represent an existential threat to his survival. Dr. Samuel Brennan claimed the third spot despite his apparent role in exposing the forgery. Wolfe argued that the most effective way to sell fakes is to control the authenticator, and Brennan possessed both the technical knowledge to create sophisticated forgeries and the professional standing to validate them selectively. His rejection of the bottle might be part of a larger scheme to manipulate market prices. The fourth name was Julian Vane, a collector whose reputation for vindictiveness bordered on the pathological. Wolfe recalled him as a man who had once spent a fortune trying to destroy a wine critic who had disparaged his cellar, and who was capable of orchestrating complex revenge against anyone who had crossed him in business. With our suspects identified, Wolfe instructed me to visit the offices of Marsh and Garrison before my evening rendezvous. He wanted me to gauge the temperature of the partnership and determine whether Leo Garrison was as nervous in person as he sounded in description. I checked my automatic, settled it into its holster, and headed out into the October evening. The offices occupied a converted townhouse in the East 60s where limestone facades gleamed under streetlights and doormen stood like sentries. It was nearly 8 o'clock when I arrived, but lights still burned on the second floor. Leo Garrison answered the door himself, looking like a man who had been trying unsuccessfully to loosen his tie for several days. He was soft around the middle, balding, with sandy hair that stood in tufts where nervous fingers had worried it. When I introduced myself as Nero Wolfe's assistant, Garrison's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if they had not been so revealing. Dismay, panic, and resignation chased each other across his features like clouds across a stormy sky. He led me upstairs to an office that smelled of stale coffee and expensive cologne, the walls lined with empty frames that suggested either recent redecoration or financial distress. Garrison collapsed into his chair and immediately began explaining that Catherine was making a terrible mistake, that she was pursuing abstract principles at the expense of practical survival. He admitted wanting to return the bottle to Torres, but insisted it was only to protect the gallery from a lawsuit they could not afford. Their finances were stretched thin, he claimed, and a legal battle would bankrupt them before the truth emerged. Before he could elaborate on their financial difficulties, the office door banged open and a man strode in who looked like he owned the building and was considering evicting everyone for sport. He was tall, thin, and expensively dressed, with a face that was mostly nose and chin and the predatory bearing of a hawk surveying a field of mice. This was Julian Vane, and he wasted no time on pleasantries. Ignoring me completely, Vane turned his fury on Garrison, demanding to know where Catherine was hiding and accusing Marsh and Garrison of peddling forgeries to their best clients. He shouted about midnight deliveries and secret accounts, threatening to expose them to the district attorney. When I stepped between them, Vane's contemptuous gaze shifted to me with the calculation of a man reassessing the opposition. Learning that Nero Wolfe was involved seemed to confirm his worst suspicions about the depth of the conspiracy he imagined. He stormed out with a parting threat that rattled the windows, leaving Garrison slumped in his chair like a man who had just received news of his own execution. I checked my watch and saw that it was 9:15. The Dark Cellar awaited, along with an anonymous informant who claimed to have answers. I left Garrison alone with his terror and headed into the night, carrying the weight of my gun and the growing certainty that we were walking into something far more complex and dangerous than a simple case of art fraud. The game, as they say, was afoot, and the stakes were rising with each passing hour. The Dark Cellar lived up to its name with the kind of deliberate gloom that attracts people who prefer their conversations conducted in whispers and their business kept off the official record. I descended a narrow staircase into a basement room where the lighting came courtesy of amber bulbs behind stained glass shades, and the clientele looked like they had all graduated from the same correspondence course in inconspicuous behavior. The bar itself was constructed from what appeared to be genuine reclaimed wood, and the air held the rich, complex aroma of aged spirits that would have impressed even Wolfe's discriminating palate. I arrived at 9:50, early enough to select a booth in the back corner that offered clear sight lines to both the entrance and the service exit. The crowd was typical for a Wednesday night in October, a mixture of professionals unwinding from the day and younger patrons who appreciated the establishment's pretensions to authenticity. I ordered a beer I had no intention of drinking and settled in to wait, watching faces and cataloguing exits with the automatic efficiency that comes from years of practice. At precisely 10 o'clock, a man entered who looked like he belonged in a university laboratory rather than a speakeasy imitation. He was perhaps 40, with wire-rimmed glasses, thinning brown hair, and the pale complexion of someone who spent most daylight hours under fluorescent lights. He wore a tweed jacket with leather patches on the elbows and carried a leather satchel that bulged with papers. When his eyes found mine, there was a flicker of recognition that told me Catherine had described me accurately. He approached with the hesitant gait of a man walking toward either salvation or disaster, and I gestured for him to sit. He introduced himself as Dr. Marcus Webb, explaining that he had worked for the past 5 years as a consultant authenticating rare spirits for auction houses and private collectors. His credentials were impressive, his manner earnest, and his hands shook slightly as he ordered a whiskey that the bartender treated with religious reverence. Webb began his story with scientific precision, explaining that 2 years ago he had been approached by a man named Richard Kelso, who claimed to represent investors interested in acquiring rare American whiskies. The consulting arrangement had seemed legitimate initially, with genuine bottles passing through his laboratory alongside the expected percentage of fakes. But gradually, Webb had noticed disturbing patterns. Bottles he authenticated would reappear months later with slightly different characteristics, and as though someone was using his reports as templates for creating improved forgeries. The revelation that broke his cooperation came 3 weeks ago, when Kelso presented him with a bottle supposedly from the same legendary distillery as Catherine's consigned piece. Webb's analysis revealed it to be a masterwork of deception, with chemical signatures that had been artificially aged, using techniques requiring both sophisticated equipment and expert knowledge. When Webb refused to authenticate it, Kelso's response had been immediate and chilling. The organization had documented Webb's every action, and his cooperation was no longer optional, but mandatory. Webb reached into his satchel and produced a thick folder containing laboratory reports, shipping records, and correspondence that documented the forgery operation in meticulous detail. He had been careful to make copies of everything, creating insurance against the organization's threats. The documents identified at least 15 auction houses that had been infiltrated, along with a network of chemists, historians, and craftsmen contributing their expertise to the enterprise. More importantly, Webb had discovered the production facility, a warehouse in Red Hook registered to a shell corporation, but operated under Kelso's supervision. The facility contained not only chemical manipulation equipment, but also a collection of genuine bottles serving as models for forgeries, bottles acquired through theft, purchase, and, in at least one documented case, armed robbery. I asked about the break-in at our brownstone, and Webb's expression grew troubled. The organization, he explained, had a particular need for authentic pre-prohibition American whiskeys as reference material. Their newest client had commissioned a series of bespoke historical recreations, forgeries designed not for resale, but to fill gaps in a private collection. To satisfy this commission, they required samples of specific bottlings, including those matching Wolfe's collection. Webb was explaining the technical challenges of recreating century-old bourbon when I noticed a man standing near the bar, whose attention seemed focused entirely on our booth. He was broad-shouldered, professionally nondescript, with his right hand resting inside his jacket in a way that suggested either a shoulder holster or an unusually protective attitude toward his wallet. When our eyes met, he turned away, with studied casualness. I told Webb we needed to leave immediately, and I could see fear flood back into his face as he realized his precautions had been insufficient. We stood and moved toward the kitchen, but before we reached the exit, 2 more men entered through the front door with coordinated timing that spoke of professional experience. The situation had transformed from information gathering to immediate danger, and I found myself calculating distances and angles while guiding Webb toward the rear of the establishment. He clutched his satchel like a life preserver, and I kept one hand on his elbow while the other moved toward my automatic. We made it through the kitchen and into the alley, where Webb pressed the folder into my hands with desperate urgency. He whispered an address in Red Hook where the warehouse could be found, then disappeared into the maze of side streets with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been planning his escape route for weeks. I returned to the brownstone past midnight to find Wolfe still awake, reading in his chair with the patience of a man who understood that some conversations could not be postponed until morning. I poured myself a glass of milk and delivered my report, omitting nothing about Webb's revelations, the documentation he had provided, or the professional interest our meeting had attracted. Wolfe listened with his eyes closed, absorbing every detail. When I finished, he opened his eyes and observed that the evening had confirmed 2 crucial facts. The opposition was well organized and possessed excellent intelligence about our activities, and we now had concrete evidence of their methods and locations. He instructed me to call Saul Panzer first thing in the morning. We needed surveillance on the Red Hook warehouse, and Saul could watch a building without being noticed by its occupants. Then he told me to get some sleep, because tomorrow we would begin applying pressure to the weak points we had identified, starting with a visit to Dr. Samuel Brennan. As I climbed the stairs, I reflected that the game had acquired a new level of complexity and danger, but we finally had the tools necessary to dismantle it piece by systematic piece. I made it back to the brownstone past midnight with Webb's documents clutched in one hand and the certain knowledge that our opposition had resources, organization, and no compunction about conducting business in public places where innocent bystanders might complicate the scenery. The 3 men at the Dark Cellar had been professionals, the kind who carry credentials in one pocket and firearms in the other, and Webb's terrified flight into the maze of side streets suggested he understood exactly what those credentials represented. Wolfe was waiting in his chair with a book and the patient expression of a man who knew that some conversations could not be postponed until morning. I poured myself a glass of milk, settled into my desk chair, and delivered a complete report while he listened with his eyes closed and his massive hands folded across his middle. When I finished, he opened his eyes and observed that the evening had confirmed 2 essential facts. Our opponents possessed excellent intelligence about our activities, and we now had concrete evidence of their methods and locations. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of gray October sky that makes promises it has no intention of keeping. I was in the kitchen by 8, consuming Fritz's coffee and my own impatience in equal measure, when Wolfe rang for me from the office. He had Webb's folder spread across his desk like a battle plan, and his first instruction was characteristically direct. I was to telephone Saul Panzer immediately, provide him with the Red Hook warehouse address, and instruct him to begin surveillance with particular attention to personnel, deliveries, and any evidence of hasty evacuation. Saul accepted the assignment with his usual professional brevity, asking only whether he should maintain passive observation or prepare for more active intervention. I told him to watch and wait, and he grunted once before hanging up to begin earning his retainer. Saul has the useful quality of blending into urban landscape like morning fog, and if anyone could monitor a criminal operation without alerting its participants, he was the man for the job. Wolfe's next instruction involved Dr. Samuel Brennan, whose office at Columbia occupied a corner of the chemistry building that smelled of reagents and academic ambition. I called ahead using Catherine's name as credentials and secured an appointment for 11 o'clock, explaining that we needed consultation on authentication procedures for a significant private collection. At precisely 11, I found myself in Brennan's laboratory, a gleaming space dominated by equipment that looked expensive enough to finance a small revolution. Brennan himself was a compact man in his late 50s with silver hair and the precise movements of someone accustomed to handling volatile substances. His handshake was firm, his manner professional, and his eyes held the calculating intelligence of a man who made his living distinguishing truth from deception at the molecular level. I explained that my employer was investigating irregularities in the rare spirits market, and that Brennan's authentication of Catherine's consigned bottle had been the catalyst for a chain of events involving theft, threats, and what appeared to be organized fraud. His reaction was immediate and controlled, a slight stiffening of posture that suggested either genuine surprise or carefully rehearsed innocence. Brennan insisted that his professional integrity was beyond question, that he had simply reported the scientific facts as his analysis revealed them. The bottle was unquestionably a forgery, he maintained, chemically distinct from genuine spirits of that vintage despite the sophistication of its construction. When I mentioned Richard Kelso by name, however, his composure developed a hairline crack that widened under pressure. I leaned forward and told him about Marcus Webb, about the Red Hook warehouse, and about the documents currently residing in Nero Wolfe's safe. I suggested that cooperation now might appear more favorable to the district attorney than stubborn silence later. Brennan removed his glasses and began polishing them with a handkerchief that had seen better days, his hands trembling slightly as he weighed his options. Finally, he admitted that representatives of certain interested parties had approached him with offers of substantial compensation for authenticating specific bottles while applying particularly rigorous standards to others. He claimed to have refused direct participation in validating forgeries, but acknowledged that his selective skepticism had served someone else's commercial interests by manipulating market confidence. Leaving Brennan to contemplate his precarious position, I headed back downtown with the satisfaction of a man who had extracted useful information without resorting to physical persuasion. The afternoon was still young, and Vincent Torres awaited my attention at his Park Avenue address. Torres occupied the penthouse of a pre-war building where the doorman wore white gloves and the lobby featured marble imported from quarries that no longer existed. I presented my credentials and explained that I represented interests concerned with irregularities in the rare spirits market, mentioning Torres by name as a potential source of clarification. Torres answered his door wearing silk pajamas and an expression of mild curiosity that transformed into wariness when I introduced myself as Nero Wolfe's assistant. He was exactly as Catherine had described. Mid-40s, well-groomed with casual elegance that suggested either breeding or careful study. His apartment reflected similar qualities, expensive without ostentation, tasteful without pretension. He invited me into a living room where floor-to-ceiling windows offered views across the park, and I noticed immediately that his hands remained steady and his manner composed. This was not a man rattled by unexpected visits or troubled by guilty conscience, which made him either innocent or exceptionally confident in his position. Torres acknowledged his dispute with Catherine Marsh, characterizing it as an unfortunate misunderstanding between professionals who should have resolved their differences privately. The bottle was absolutely genuine, he insisted, inherited exactly as documented. Dr. Brennan's negative authentication was either mistaken or motivated by factors Torres preferred not to speculate about publicly. When I mentioned the break-in at our own brownstone, Torres's smile widened into something that looked genuinely pleased. He suggested that perhaps we should examine our own security arrangements before investigating others, and that professional jealousy sometimes manifested in unexpected ways. I left him with his smugness intact, but carrying the certainty that Vincent Torres knew far more about our situation than any innocent collector should. The afternoon shadows were lengthening as I returned to report my findings, and I found myself wondering what Saul had discovered at the warehouse and whether our opponents were as confident as they appeared. The game was accelerating, and the stakes were rising with each passing hour. I returned to the brownstone just after 4:30, carrying impressions of two very different men who had each revealed more than they intended. Brennan was a coward, discovering that his selective honesty had made him vulnerable to both sides of a criminal enterprise, while Torres possessed the casual confidence of a man who knew exactly which cards were still hidden in the deck. Wolfe was waiting in the office, with Webb's documents spread across his desk like a battle map, and he looked up as I entered with the expression of a general receiving field reports from his scouts. Before I could begin my account of the afternoon's interviews, the telephone rang with the insistence that suggested either emergency or opportunity. I answered to find Saul Panzer on the line, his voice carrying the flat precision that meant he had observed something significant at the Red Hook warehouse. Wolfe gestured for me to put the call on speaker, and Saul's report filled the office with the kind of information that transforms speculation into certainty. The warehouse had been active throughout the day, Saul explained, with deliveries of laboratory equipment and what appeared to be genuine antique bottles based on the careful handling they received. More importantly, he had observed and photographed several key figures entering the building, including Richard Kelso himself, and a man he recognized from previous cases as David Reese, a chemical engineer with a history of sophisticated fraud. But the revelation that elevated surveillance to breakthrough came at 2:15 that afternoon, when a black sedan had delivered 3 passengers whose identities connected every thread of our investigation. Vincent Torres had emerged from the vehicle with the casual authority of a man visiting his own property, accompanied by Leo Garrison, whose nervous demeanor suggested he was there under duress rather than choice. The third passenger was someone Saul identified as Malcolm Hendricks, a collector whose reputation for acquiring rare spirits through questionable means was matched only by his willingness to pay premium prices for premium deceptions. Wolfe absorbed this intelligence with the satisfaction of a man watching his theories confirmed by observable fact. The forgery operation was more sophisticated than we had initially understood, he explained, operating on multiple levels with carefully distributed responsibilities. Kelso managed production and technical operations, employing chemists like Reese to create forgeries sophisticated enough to fool expert analysis. Torres served as the front man, using his reputation and social connections to place forgeries with unsuspecting auction houses while simultaneously acquiring genuine bottles through legitimate channels for use as reference materials. The genius of the operation, Wolfe continued, lay in its manipulation of authentication itself. By controlling both the creation of forgeries and their selective exposure, the organization could manipulate market confidence with surgical precision. A forgery exposed at one gallery would drive collectors toward supposedly safer sources elsewhere, sources that the organization conveniently controlled through intermediaries like Torres. Leo Garrison's role was now painfully clear. He had been recruited or coerced into providing inside access to Marsh & Garrison's operations, identifying potential marks and facilitating the placement of forgeries. His desperation to return the bottle to Torres had nothing to do with protecting the gallery's reputation and everything to do with preventing exposure of his own complicity. While we were discussing the implications of Saul's discoveries, the telephone rang again. This time it was Catherine Marsh, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. Leo Garrison had just called from the gallery, she explained, sounding terrified and nearly incoherent. Julian Vane had returned to their offices, this time accompanied by two men who were definitely not art collectors, demanding access to private records and threatening consequences if their demands were not met. Garrison had locked himself in his office and was calling for help. Wolfe's response was immediate and characteristically decisive. He instructed me to proceed to the gallery, secure the premises if possible, and determine what had become of Leo Garrison. The situation was escalating beyond the boundaries of polite investigation into territory where physical intervention might become necessary, a development that Wolfe found distasteful but unavoidable. I checked my automatic, grabbed my hat, and headed out into the gathering October dusk. The taxi ride felt interminably long, Manhattan traffic conspiring against urgency, as it always does when time matters most. When I finally arrived at the gallery, the street was quiet, but something felt wrong about the quality of that silence. The front door stood slightly ajar, its glass panel shattered near the handle. I drew my gun and entered carefully, moving through the gallery's elegant rooms toward the rear offices. The main exhibition space was undisturbed, but the administrative area told a different story entirely. Files had been pulled from cabinets and scattered across the floor, desks overturned, and the safe in Garrison's office stood open and empty. But there was no sign of Leo Garrison, Julian Vane, or his associates. The only evidence of their presence was the destruction they had left behind, and a small leather notebook that had been dropped near the overturned desk. I retrieved it and found pages filled with handwritten entries listing dates, amounts, and initials that corresponded precisely to the forgery transactions Webb had documented. More significantly, the notebook contained a series of entries labeled VT with substantial payments alongside dates that matched Torres's consignments to the gallery. I returned to the brownstone with the notebook and a growing sense that events were accelerating beyond our ability to control them. Wolfe examined the evidence with intense satisfaction, declaring it the final piece necessary to demonstrate the financial connections binding Torres, Garrison, and the forgery operation in a web of mutual dependency that none of them could deny. But before we could plan our next move, Fritz appeared in the doorway with an expression of mild surprise. Julian Vane was in the hall, he announced, requesting immediate audience with Wolfe and claiming to possess information that would clarify his role in the evening's events. Wolfe instructed Fritz to show him in, and Vane entered looking considerably less like a conquering collector and more like a man who had suddenly realized he was standing in quicksand. His hands trembled slightly as he settled into the red leather chair, and his first words were a protestation of innocence regarding Garrison's disappearance. He had gone to the gallery to confront Garrison about the forgeries, Vane explained, only to find the offices already ransacked and Garrison nowhere to be found. The two men who had accompanied him were private investigators he had hired to document evidence of fraud, not the thugs that Garrison had apparently assumed them to be. When they discovered the break-in, Vane had dismissed his investigators and come directly to Wolfe, recognizing that he needed professional help to avoid being framed for crimes he had not committed. Wolfe regarded him with skepticism, pointing out that his earlier threats against Garrison provided excellent motive for police suspicion. Vane paled as he realized the trap closing around him, then offered to hire Wolfe immediately to prove his innocence and identify the real criminals. Wolfe accepted the retainer with the stipulation that Vane remain in the brownstone until Inspector Kramer arrived to take his statement. As I telephoned police headquarters to report Garrison's disappearance and the gallery break-in, I could see Wolfe's mind working through the final calculations. We had the evidence, we had witnesses, and we had suspects gathering in our own office. The pieces were moving rapidly toward their final positions, and I knew that before another day passed, we would be orchestrating one of Wolfe's signature confrontations. The game had entered its final phase, and Nero Wolfe was preparing to spring the trap he had been constructing since our cellar was first violated by unknown hands. Inspector Kramer arrived at the brownstone just after 10 o'clock, bringing with him the familiar aroma of cheap cigars and the expression of a man who suspected he was being manipulated by professionals. He surveyed the office with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to distrust convenient explanations, taking in Julian Vane's nervous posture, Wolfe's imperturbable presence behind the desk, and my own carefully neutral expression with equal skepticism. Kramer's interrogation of Vane proceeded with methodical thoroughness, covering the collector's movements from his initial visit to the gallery through his discovery of the ransacked offices. Vane maintained his story with admirable consistency, insisting that he had arrived to find the break-in already completed and Leo Garrison nowhere to be found. His hired investigators, he claimed, were legitimate private detectives engaged to document evidence of fraud, not the thugs that Garrison had apparently mistaken them for. When Kramer demanded to examine Garrison's notebook, Wolfe declined with the observation that it constituted evidence in an ongoing private investigation and would be delivered to proper authorities once his client's interests had been adequately protected. This produced the expected explosion of protest from Kramer, who pointed out that withholding evidence in a criminal investigation was itself criminal behavior. The argument that followed traced familiar patterns worn smooth by years of similar disputes, until Wolfe offered his customary compromise. He would convene all interested parties at the brownstone the following evening, presenting a complete solution to the case and delivering all relevant evidence to Inspector Kramer for appropriate legal action. Kramer accepted this arrangement with resigned irritation, extracting promises that Wolfe would not interfere with the official search for Leo Garrison and would immediately report any contact from suspects. After Kramer departed with Vane in tow for additional questioning at headquarters, Wolfe sat in contemplative silence before outlining the preparations necessary for tomorrow's confrontation. The systematic invitation process began with Catherine Marsh, who accepted immediately with relief that the investigation was approaching resolution. Vincent Torres required more persuasion, his initial refusal softening only when I mentioned that Inspector Kramer would be present and that his absence might be interpreted as consciousness of guilt. Dr. Samuel Brennan agreed to attend with the resignation of a man who had already accepted that his professional reputation was beyond salvaging. When he asked whether he should bring his attorney, I told him that cooperation might prove more valuable than legal protection if he hoped to avoid prosecution. With the invitations issued, Wolfe turned his attention to coordinating with Saul Panzer, who reported increased activity at the Red Hook warehouse. Equipment was being dismantled and loaded into trucks, personnel were carrying boxes to waiting vehicles, and Richard Kelso was supervising the evacuation with obvious urgency. This intelligence prompted Wolfe to telephone Inspector Kramer with the warehouse location, fulfilling his promise not to interfere while ensuring that police would arrive in time to prevent complete destruction of evidence. The most crucial preparation involved a thorough re-examination of our own cellar. Wolfe instructed me to conduct a precise inspection of the shelves where the missing bottles had been stored, counting everything comparable that remained and listing any bottles whose provenance might intersect with Torres's documented purchases. Fritz accompanied me below with the solemnity of a man entering a desecrated chapel, hovering like a guardian spirit while I documented the collection. The investigation revealed more than simple theft. 2 bottles were missing, both pre-prohibition bourbons from distilleries now abandoned to history. But 3 others bore numbers on their original shipping labels that matched partial references in Webb's documents to source lots. This was not coincidence, but bookkeeping, evidence of systematic targeting based on detailed knowledge of our collection's contents and historical significance. When I brought my notes back upstairs, Wolfe studied them alongside Webb's folder, tracing connections between numbers, dates, and acquisition records with his finger. The pattern, once revealed, was simple and damning. Whoever had compiled the shopping list for our cellar burglary possessed access not only to our collection, but to detailed records of historic shipments, suggesting a particular kind of expertise and a particular kind of arrogance. Friday morning arrived with persistent rain that matched the gravity of our preparations. I spent the early hours confirming arrangements and reviewing the evidence we would present, while Fritz arranged the office to accommodate our expected guests. Chairs were positioned in a semicircle facing Wolfe's desk like a jury box awaiting the presentation of evidence, and I confirmed that the genuine bottle Catherine had brought remained secure in our safe alongside Garrison's incriminating notebook. At 6 o'clock, Wolfe descended from the plant rooms and reviewed our preparations with the meticulous attention that preceded his most important performances. He specified the order in which guests should be seated, identified which documents should be readily accessible, and outlined the sequence in which revelations should be presented for maximum psychological impact. By afternoon, Saul reported that police had surrounded the warehouse and were securing the premises, though significant equipment had already been removed. The timing suggested that our opponents possessed excellent intelligence about official investigations, but their haste also indicated growing desperation. As evening approached, I found myself reflecting on the case's architecture and the way seemingly unconnected elements had gradually revealed their underlying structure. The forgery operation had been sophisticated enough to fool experts and ambitious enough to target multiple markets simultaneously, but it had made the fatal error of violating Nero Wolfe's personal sanctuary. At 8:30, our guests began arriving with the punctuality of people who understood that their futures hung in the balance. Catherine Marsh came first, dressed in somber gray and carrying herself with the dignity of someone who had survived betrayal. Vincent Torres arrived precisely on schedule, his casual elegance intact, but his eyes watchful and calculating. Dr. Brennan appeared without his attorney, a decision that suggested either innocence or complete resignation to his fate. Inspector Kramer arrived last, settling into his chair with the air of a man prepared to witness either justice or theatrical performance, possibly both. At precisely 9 o'clock, Wolfe surveyed the assembled company and prepared to begin the methodical dismantling of lies that would expose the truth beneath. The game had reached its final stage, and Nero Wolfe was ready to demonstrate exactly how a master detective transforms scattered evidence into irrefutable proof. The confrontation that would resolve everything was about to begin. Wolfe surveyed the assembled company with the measured deliberation of a judge preparing to deliver a verdict that would reshape several lives irrevocably. The office held that peculiar quality of suspended anticipation that precedes either revelation or catastrophe, and I could see each person calculating their position and weighing their chances for survival. Outside, the October rain continued its relentless percussion against the windows, providing a fitting soundtrack for the drama about to unfold. He began not with accusations, but with methodology, explaining that successful fraud required 3 essential components: technical sophistication, market access, and credible authentication. The forgery operation we had uncovered possessed all 3 in abundance, representing an evolution of ancient deception into something approaching industrial precision. It required chemists capable of recreating century-old chemical signatures, craftsmen skilled in reproducing antique bottles and labels, and most crucially, access to authentication networks that could validate forgeries while discrediting legitimate competitors. Vincent Torres shifted uncomfortably as Wolfe's narrative approached the mechanisms of distribution. The most effective method for introducing forgeries into legitimate markets, Wolfe explained, involved establishing credibility through genuine transactions before gradually substituting counterfeits. A collector who successfully consigned several authentic pieces would naturally be trusted when presenting subsequent items, particularly if those items arrived with impeccable documentation and past initial authentication procedures. Torres had played this role to perfection, Wolfe continued, using his reputation and social connections to place sophisticated forgeries with unsuspecting galleries while simultaneously acquiring genuine bottles through legitimate channels. The genius lay not in creating perfect fakes, but in controlling the entire authentication process through compromised experts and manipulated market confidence. Dr. Brennan's face had gone ashen as Wolfe turned his attention to the authentication network. Brennan's role, Wolfe explained, had been to provide scientific credibility to market manipulation by applying rigorous standards to competitors while offering more charitable interpretations to the organization's products. The rejection of Catherine's consigned bottle had been calculated sabotage, designed to force its return before independent analysis could expose the forgery's sophisticated construction. But Brennan had been trapped by his own expertise, Wolfe observed. When presented with Webb's documentation of the chemical shortcuts used in forgery production, Brennan had realized that his selective authentications had served criminal purposes. His cooperation tonight demonstrated belated recognition that scientific integrity, once compromised, became worthless currency in any market. Inspector Kramer interrupted to ask about the Red Hook warehouse operation, and Wolfe produced Webb's folder with its detailed documentation of production methods and shipping records. The warehouse served as both laboratory and distribution center, he explained, where chemists like David Reese created forgeries sophisticated enough to fool expert analysis, while logistics coordinators managed placement through compromised galleries nationwide. The operation's weakness, Wolfe continued, lay in its appetite for authentic reference materials. Creating convincing forgeries required access to genuine bottles for chemical analysis and physical modeling. This need had driven the systematic theft campaign that had ultimately brought the organization to his attention through the violation of his own cellar. Leo Garrison's disappearance, Wolfe explained, resulted from panic rather than violence. Garrison had served as the organization's inside man at Marsh & Garrison, providing access to client records and facilitating the placement of forgeries. When Catherine's investigation threatened exposure, Garrison had attempted to steal bottles from Wolfe's cellar to satisfy the organization's demands for reference materials. His failure and subsequent flight represented the collapse of nerve under pressure. But the true architect of the scheme, Wolfe announced, was neither Torres nor Kelso, but someone whose identity had emerged through systematic analysis of financial records and operational patterns. He directed my attention to Garrison's notebook, pointing out entries that revealed payments routed through shell companies controlled by Julian Vane, the collector whose obsession with completing his collection had motivated the entire enterprise. Vane had commissioned the forgery operation not merely to acquire unavailable bottles, but to manipulate market values through strategic exposure of competitors' holdings. By controlling both the creation of forgeries and their selective authentication, Vane could destroy rival collections while enhancing the value of his own supposedly pristine holdings. The break-in at Marsh & Garrison had been orchestrated to recover incriminating records when Garrison's panic threatened the operation's security. The ransacking of the gallery served dual purposes, eliminating evidence and sending a message that resistance would be met with escalating consequences. Torres finally spoke, his voice carrying controlled anger as he demanded proof rather than speculation. Wolfe obliged by producing shipping manifests showing Torres's personal receipt of deliveries at the Red Hook warehouse, signatures confirmed by Saul's photographic surveillance. The documents established Torres's central role in distribution while connecting him directly to the production facility. As if summoned by Wolfe's revelation, Fritz appeared in the doorway with an expression of mild surprise. Two gentlemen were at the front door, he announced, requesting immediate admission and identifying themselves as federal agents investigating interstate fraud. Before anyone could respond, the agents entered with Leo Garrison between them, looking like a man who had spent days running from demons both real and imagined. Garrison's voluntary surrender transformed the confrontation from interrogation to confession. He was prepared to testify completely, he announced, to provide documentation of the entire operation and to identify every participant in exchange for protection from the organization's retribution. His cooperation eliminated any remaining questions about evidence or testimony. What followed was methodical dismantling, as Garrison detailed the organization's structure, methods, and participants. He identified Kelso as operational director, Reese as chief chemist, and Torres as primary distributor, while confirming Vane's role as financier and strategic mastermind. The confession provided federal authorities with evidence sufficient to dismantle the entire network. By midnight, Inspector Kramer had coordinated with federal agents to execute warrants and arrests across 3 states. Torres sat in defeated silence as officers led him away, his elegant facade finally shattered beyond repair. Brennan departed under federal protection, facing professional ruin but avoiding prosecution in exchange for continued cooperation. After the office emptied, Wolfe sat in contemplative silence before observing that human appetite for authenticity remained inversely proportional to willingness to pay its true price. I asked whether he was referring to bourbon or people, and he replied that the distinction was perhaps less meaningful than we preferred to imagine. The brownstone was quiet again, its sanctity restored through the application of logic to evidence and the systematic exposure of deception masquerading as expertise. The office emptied slowly after the arrests, leaving behind the lingering scent of tension and the satisfied weight of justice properly administered. Inspector Kramer remained in the red leather chair, his expression carrying the grudging respect of a man who had watched Nero Wolfe dismantle a criminal conspiracy with nothing more dangerous than logic and carefully timed revelation. I poured myself a glass of milk and settled back to watch him process the evening's events, while Wolfe sat in contemplative silence behind his desk. Kramer wanted to understand how Wolfe had identified Julian Vane as the operation's mastermind when all visible evidence had pointed toward Torres and Kelso as the primary actors. Wolfe explained that financial analysis had revealed the crucial pattern connecting shell companies to Vane's family trust. But more importantly, the selection of stolen bottles demonstrated expertise beyond mere criminal opportunism. The thieves had targeted specific distilleries and vintages that corresponded precisely to gaps in Vane's own collection, suggesting not random profit-seeking but systematic completion of a collector's obsession. The break-in at our brownstone had provided final confirmation. The stolen bottles matched items that Vane had attempted to purchase from Wolfe 3 years earlier, an offer declined with the observation that some things were not for sale at any price. Vane's subsequent acquisition through theft rather than negotiation demonstrated both his determination and his willingness to employ criminal methods when legitimate channels failed. After Kramer departed with promises of complete documentation for federal prosecutors, Catherine Marsh emerged from the front room where she had waited during the police proceedings. She looked exhausted, her composure finally cracking after days of mounting pressure, but the rigid tension that had defined her posture was gone. She sat in the red leather chair not with a client's poise, but with a survivor's weariness. Her first question cut straight to the heart of her concerns. Could her gallery survive the scandal? Would the revelation of Leo's betrayal destroy the trust she had spent 15 years building with collectors and institutions? Wolfe regarded her with uncharacteristic gentleness, explaining that transparency would serve her better than evasion. She must make complete disclosure about the attempted consignment, the discovery of forgery, the break-in, and her cooperation with the investigation. Her reputation would be damaged, but not destroyed, provided she positioned herself as authenticity's champion rather than fraud's victim. The fee discussion proceeded with mutual satisfaction. Wolfe proposed his standard rate with a modification that demonstrated his particular genius for arrangements that served multiple purposes. He would reduce the cash payment in exchange for first refusal on any pre-prohibition American whiskies that might pass through her gallery over the next 5 years. Catherine agreed immediately, recognizing both the financial relief and the implicit vote of confidence in her professional future. As she prepared to leave, Fritz appeared with the recovered bottles from our cellar, handling them with the reverence reserved for returned prisoners of war. Wolfe examined each one under his reading lamp, checking seals and labels with microscopic attention before pronouncing them undamaged by their ordeal. Fritz bore them away to the cellar with visible relief, restoring the collection's integrity along with the household's peace of mind. The brownstone settled into its natural rhythm as the night deepened toward morning. I organized my notes while Wolfe remained in his chair, staring thoughtfully at the space where evidence had been displayed. He observed that it was a peculiar feature of human nature to value the representation of a thing over the thing itself. Vane had possessed wealth sufficient to acquire almost any genuine experience, yet he had derived his greatest satisfaction from manipulating falsehoods and destroying authentic value to elevate his own collection's price. The dining room awaited us with Fritz's preparation of braised lamb, its aroma banishing the lingering sense of police work and criminal enterprise. We ate in the ritual silence that marked the true conclusion of a case, the return to sensory sanctuary after intellectual combat. When his immediate hunger was satisfied, Wolfe poured beer and leaned back with the expression of a man whose universe had been restored to proper order. He spoke then of bourbon's chemistry, of the patient interaction between wood and spirit and air that occurred in darkness over decades. It was a process that could neither be hurried nor faked without leaving traces for those who knew how to look. The forgers had been clever but arrogant, assuming that replicating chemical formulas could replicate the soul of aged spirits. They had forgotten that time itself was an ingredient, the one element that could not be stolen or counterfeited. When I suggested opening one of the recovered bottles in celebration, Wolfe looked genuinely shocked. The bottles had suffered trauma, he explained, having been vibrated in vehicles, handled by criminals, and subjected to the indignity of police evidence rooms. They would require at least 6 months of rest before approaching them with a corkscrew. To open them now would constitute barbarism of the highest order. As Fritz cleared the table, Wolfe offered his final observation on the case. The most dangerous trace a man leaves, he noted, is not in dust or chemistry, but in the distortions he creates in other lives. Vane had thought himself trackless, but he had warped the behavior of everyone around him until the pattern of their distortions pointed back to him as inevitably as a compass indicates north. It was, he concluded with satisfaction, an elegant piece of geometry. I agreed that it was also an elegant payday, earning one of his rare almost smiles. He announced his intention to spend the morning with his orchids, undisturbed by anything short of catastrophe, and headed for the elevator with the measured tread of a man whose work was complete. I secured the brownstone for the night, checking locks and setting bolts while listening to the expensive silence that money cannot buy, but integrity can earn. The bourbon trace had been wiped clean, the cellar was whole, and tomorrow would bring new troubles to our door. But tonight, the only things in the dark cellar were whiskey bottles where they belonged, aging patiently in their proper places, authentic and undisturbed. The case was closed, justice was served, and Nero Wolfe had once again demonstrated that logic applied systematically could triumph over even the most sophisticated deception. In a world increasingly filled with forgeries and frauds, the brownstone remained a sanctuary where genuine articles were properly valued and protected. Saturday morning arrived with a kind of brilliant October sunlight that transforms the previous night's drama into something approaching manageable reality. I was halfway through Fritz's coffee when the telephone announced that the federal government had not forgotten our address overnight. The caller was Special Agent Lockridge, compact and efficient, who arrived within the hour carrying a folder thick enough to represent either comprehensive documentation or bureaucratic excess. Lockridge settled into the front room with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to delivering official gratitude while simultaneously gathering additional intelligence. The Red Hook warehouse raids had exceeded expectations, he explained, yielding not only production equipment, but detailed records documenting 3 years of systematic fraud. Richard Kelso had been arrested at Kennedy Airport, attempting to board a flight to Mexico City, while David Reese had surrendered peacefully at his Brooklyn apartment, apparently relieved that his role in the conspiracy had finally reached its conclusion. More significantly, Julian Vane had broken under interrogation, providing federal prosecutors with detailed financial records connecting shell companies to offshore accounts that had funded the entire operation. His confession implicated a network spanning multiple countries, with forgeries placed in galleries from London to Hong Kong. The scope was staggering, a testament to what obsession backed by unlimited resources could achieve when divorced from ethical constraints. Lockridge wanted Wolfe's opinion on which international clients might warrant investigation based on purchasing patterns documented in the seized records. I promised to present the request at 11 o'clock, when Wolfe would descend from his morning communion with the orchids. After Lockridge departed with assurances of continued cooperation, I used the interval to review the federal documentation, noting that our stolen bottles were listed among recovered evidence and would be returned after evidentiary processing. At precisely 11, I climbed to the plant rooms where Wolfe was misting a collection of Miltonias with the concentration of a man conducting delicate surgery. I delivered Lockridge's report while he continued his ministrations, watching his face for reactions to the news of Vane's complete collapse. He received the information with satisfaction, observing that desperate men inevitably make predictable mistakes, and that Vane's attempt to control rather than evade investigation had demonstrated the kind of miscalculation that doomed criminal enterprises from their inception. When I mentioned the federal request for guidance on international suspects, Wolfe granted one of his rare, almost smiles. He would provide the Bureau with a carefully considered list, he decided, partly from civic duty, but mostly because the exercise would demonstrate the elegant geometry underlying criminal conspiracy. We descended to the office, where he spent an hour reviewing Webb's documentation alongside the federal evidence, identifying patterns that pointed toward specific collectors whose purchasing behavior suggested either willing collaboration or willful blindness. The afternoon brought Marcus Webb to our door, the chemist whose desperate telephone call had initiated our investigation. He looked considerably less terrified than during our clandestine meeting at the Dark Cellar, though wariness still marked his movements as he settled into the red leather chair. Federal custody had treated him well, he explained, and his cooperation had earned immunity from prosecution in exchange for expert witness testimony that would help convict the entire network. Webb wanted to thank Wolfe personally for creating circumstances that had allowed him to escape the organization's control without suffering the violent retribution he had feared. More than that, he wanted to understand how Wolfe had identified the pattern connecting stolen bottles to Vane's collection when Webb himself had been too close to the operation to perceive its underlying structure. Wolfe explained that distance provided perspective unavailable to participants, no matter how observant those participants might be. Webb had documented individual transactions with scientific precision, but he had lacked the comprehensive view necessary to perceive how those transactions served a collector's obsessive completion of an impossible collection. The pattern became visible only when examined from sufficient remove, when individual data points resolved into geometric proof of centralized direction. After Webb departed with visible relief, I asked Wolfe the question that had been nagging me since our confrontation. How had he known with such certainty that Vane was the mastermind when all physical evidence initially pointed toward Torres and Kelso? Wolfe settled deeper into his chair, regarding me with the expression of a teacher addressing a promising but occasionally slow student. The key, he explained, lay in understanding the nature of the thefts. A criminal organization seeking profit would target items with the highest resale value and greatest liquidity. But the bottles stolen from our cellar and others were not the most expensive items available. They were specific vintages and distilleries that filled historical gaps. This pattern indicated a collector's mind at work, someone driven by completion rather than accumulation. Torres was a merchant interested in turnover and profit margins. Kelso was a technician focused on production and distribution. Only Vane fit the profile of a man obsessed with possessing complete history, regardless of how that history was obtained or manufactured. Furthermore, the financial scale of the operation required capital that neither Torres nor Kelso possessed initially. Setting up production facilities, hiring expert chemists, and sustaining operations before profits began flowing required a patron with deep pockets and long-term perspective. Vane's family wealth provided the necessary foundation, while his psychological profile provided the motive. As if summoned by our discussion, Catherine Marsh arrived with a confession that added final clarity to the case's resolution. She had visited the Red Hook warehouse before the police raid, she explained, driven by need to witness the physical manifestation of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed her professional reputation. What she found there confirmed that Leo's betrayal extended further back than anyone had imagined, encompassing theft from their own clients alongside facilitation of the forgery network. Among the bottles stored as reference materials, she had recognized pieces from her gallery's inventory, items that Leo had claimed were accidentally damaged during authentication testing. Seeing them intact on warehouse shelves had provided the final proof of his comprehensive treachery. She had photographed the bottles for insurance purposes but had touched nothing, understanding that even justified recovery might complicate evidence chains. Her restraint demonstrated the disciplined intelligence that would serve her well in rebuilding her reputation, Wolfe observed. The afternoon concluded with Catherine's delivery of 6 bottles of legitimate pre-prohibition bourbon, a gift expressing gratitude for restoration of her professional life. Fritz received the bottles with solemn joy, immediately finding spaces on the cellar shelves where they could rest undisturbed for the requisite acclimation period. As evening approached, we sat in the office with the comfortable silence that follows successful conclusion of difficult work. Wolfe observed that the case had demonstrated an essential truth about human nature and material value. People sought authenticity in objects because they could not find it in themselves, and that seeking made them vulnerable to those who understood how to manufacture convincing representations of genuine experience. His investigation of crime, he reflected, was simply an extension of his botanical studies, identifying pests, isolating rot, and pruning away dead wood to protect healthy organisms. The forgery case had been a study in artificiality, an attempt to mimic life through chemistry and deception. He had exposed it by applying nature's rigorous standards, where truth is structural and lies eventually collapse under their own weight. The brownstone was secure, the case was closed, and Monday would bring new problems to our door. But tonight, in the sanctuary, we had defended against violation. Everything was exactly as it should be. The bourbon trace in the Dark Cellar had been wiped clean, and Nero Wolfe had once again demonstrated that authentic value, properly protected and patiently aged, would always triumph over even the most sophisticated counterfeit. The telephone rang, announcing tomorrow's troubles, but for now, we would rest in the knowledge that justice, like good bourbon, improves with proper aging and careful attention to detail. The Sunday papers carried the story on page 3, buried beneath the usual political squabbles and international posturing, which was exactly where the federal prosecutors wanted it. The headline read, Art fraud ring dismantled in multi-state raid, a dry summary that captured none of the elegance or malice of the operation we'd spent the week dissecting. I read the article aloud to Wolfe while he consumed his second cup of coffee and his first helping of Fritz's coddled eggs, watching for the slight lift of an eyebrow that would indicate his opinion of the journalistic accuracy. The article mentioned Vincent Torres and Richard Kelso by name, identifying them as the operational leaders of a sophisticated network that had defrauded collectors of millions. It alluded to a prominent financier whose identity was being withheld pending further investigation, a discretion that Julian Vane's lawyers had undoubtedly purchased at considerable expense, though we both knew it was a temporary dam against an inevitable flood. The most interesting omission was any mention of Nero Wolfe. Our involvement had been carefully scrubbed from the official record, reduced to the phrase cooperation from private citizens, which is police code for we needed help, but we are not going to admit who gave it to us. Wolfe grunted when I finished reading, a sound that could have meant anything from satisfaction to indigestion, though given the quality of the eggs, I assumed it was the former. He instructed me to file the clipping in the case folder, then turned his attention to the more pressing matter of the Sunday crossword puzzle, which he attacked with the same ruthless efficiency he had applied to the forgery ring. Monday morning brought Catherine Marsh to our door, accompanied by a gentleman she introduced as Harold Pemberton, her attorney. Pemberton was silver-haired and expensive, carrying himself with the confidence of a man whose billable hours could finance small nations. Catherine looked considerably more composed than during her previous visits, her posture reflecting the relief of someone who had survived professional catastrophe and emerged with reputation intact. Pemberton opened with formal gratitude for Wolfe's investigation, then transitioned smoothly into business. Several of Catherine's clients had expressed interest in retaining Wolfe's services for authentication consulting, recognizing that his methods had exposed fraud that conventional experts had missed. The proposed arrangement would involve substantial retainer fees in exchange for periodic review of significant acquisitions, providing clients with confidence that their investments represented genuine value rather than sophisticated deception. Wolfe listened with his eyes half closed, calculating whether the arrangement would prove sufficiently interesting to justify disruption to his schedule. When Pemberton finished, Wolfe remained silent before explaining that he was a detective, not an authenticator, and that his investigation had been motivated by violation of his home rather than commercial opportunity. However, he continued, the case had demonstrated that conventional authentication methods were vulnerable to systematic manipulation. If Miss Marsh wished to establish more rigorous standards, he would provide occasional consultation on methodology, provided such consultation did not require him to leave the brownstone or interrupt his orchid schedule. The fee structure he proposed made Pemberton blink twice before recovering and agreeing to present the terms to interested clients. Tuesday afternoon brought Inspector Kramer, this time without his usual tension. The federal case was proceeding smoothly, he reported, with enough evidence to ensure convictions on multiple counts. Leo Garrison's cooperation had provided prosecutors with detailed testimony connecting every participant to specific criminal acts, while Webb's technical expertise would demonstrate the sophistication of the operation to juries. The investigation had also uncovered similar operations in 3 other cities, suggesting Vane's network was just one branch of a larger criminal enterprise. Kramer asked whether Wolfe had any interest in consulting on the broader investigation. Wolfe declined with the observation that he had satisfied his obligation to justice by exposing those who had violated his home, and that extending involvement further would constitute the kind of ongoing commitment he found philosophically objectionable. Wednesday brought the recovered bottles from federal custody, having been photographed and documented for trial evidence. Fritz restored them to their proper positions with visible satisfaction, conducting a comprehensive inventory that documented every bottle with the precision of a man who had learned that eternal vigilance was the price of a properly maintained collection. Thursday afternoon delivered a package from Julian Vane's attorney, containing a formal letter of apology and a cashier's check representing restitution plus punitive damages. The letter was brief and professionally crafted, acknowledging criminal responsibility without providing additional ammunition for civil litigation. Wolfe examined the check with satisfaction before instructing me to deposit it and send Vane's attorney a receipt acknowledging that the matter was settled. Friday brought Marcus Webb back to our door, accompanied by a woman he introduced as his wife, a biochemist who had spent the week wondering whether her husband would survive his involvement with criminal conspiracy. They wanted to express gratitude in person, and Mrs. Webb presented Fritz with a bottle of cognac that brought tears to his eyes when he examined the label. It was a family heirloom her grandfather had brought from France before the war, offered as thanks for saving her husband's life. Wolfe accepted the gift with genuine appreciation, observing that such generosity elevated gratitude beyond mere obligation into authentic human connection. He invited them for lunch, and Fritz prepared a meal that demonstrated his conviction that food was the proper medium for celebrating survival. Webb mentioned he had been offered a university position, contingent on his testimony, concluding without criminal charges. The offer represented both professional redemption and personal vindication, proof that cooperation with justice could restore reputation as well as freedom. Saturday afternoon found a messenger at our door bearing a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with ancient string. Inside, nestled in straw, was a single bottle of clear glass, unlabeled save for a handwritten tag. The accompanying note was from Dr. Sands, Samuel Brennan, written on university stationery he would likely soon lose the right to use. The bottle contained genuine pre-prohibition spirit from the distillery at the heart of our case, a sample he had kept in his personal reference library for 30 years. He offered it not as payment, but as apology for the violation of scientific principles he had allowed himself to commit. He was retiring to Vermont, he wrote, to grow apples and think about the difference between chemistry and truth. Wolfe examined the bottle with reverence usually reserved for rare orchids. He held it to the light, observing the viscosity and amber hue that spoke of decades in charred oak. Then, surprising me, he handed it to Fritz and instructed him to place it in the safe, not the cellar. It was a reminder that expertise without character was merely a tool for deception, and he wanted it where we would see it occasionally, lest we become too impressed with our own cleverness. Sunday evening, as the brownstone settled into its natural rhythm, Wolfe stood before the large globe, spinning it slowly with one finger. He asked if I had ever tasted genuine 1917 bourbon. I told him my experience with whiskey that old was limited to magazine pictures. He nodded, walked to the safe, and retrieved Brennan's bottle. He called for Fritz to bring 3 glasses, not crystal tumblers, but small tasting glasses used for serious analysis. When Fritz arrived, looking curious, Wolfe uncorked the bottle. The sound was a soft sigh, the release of air trapped since Woodrow Wilson was in the White House. The aroma that filled the room was immediate and overpowering: vanilla, caramel, old leather, and something dusty and sharp that smelled like history itself. Wolfe poured a small measure into each glass, handed one to Fritz, one to me, and took the third himself. He held it to the light, inspecting the color one final time, then raised his glass in silent toast. We drank. It was impossibly smooth, with heat that bloomed late in the throat and complexity that made you want to close your eyes and listen to your own tongue. It tasted of corn and rye, but also of time. It tasted of a world that did not exist anymore, a world before wars, before the Depression, before the chaos of the century had fully taken hold. It was the taste of authenticity. Wolfe lowered his glass and observed that the tragedy of the forgers was not that they failed to replicate chemical composition, but that they failed to understand that flavor is narrative. You cannot synthesize a story. You can only inherit it or live it. Vane wanted to buy the story, without living the time, and that is theft that nature does not permit. We finished the bourbon in silence. Fritz took the glasses away like holy relics. Wolfe returned to his desk and picked up his book, a history of the Ottoman Empire he had been threatening to finish for months. The case was closed, files put away, check in the bank. I asked why he had been so sure Vane would keep the stolen bottles rather than destroying them to hide evidence. Wolfe did not look up from his book. He said I was forgetting collector psychology. To destroy the object of obsession negates the reason for crime. Vane stole them because he loved them in his twisted way. He could no more destroy those bottles than a mother could destroy her child to save herself from kidnapping charges. His possession was his purpose. To lose them was to lose himself. He turned a page, the sound loud in the quiet room. He added that it is always the thing we love most that betrays us, because it is the only thing we cannot bring ourselves to guard against. Vane loved his collection more than his freedom, and so he lost both. I finished typing the final report, the keys clacking familiar rhythm. The house was quiet, settled into evening routine. The smell of roasting duck drifted from the kitchen, rich and savory, promising dinner that would be, as always, a masterpiece of genuine art. I thought about the empty space on the cellar shelf where stolen bottles had been, now filled again. About Catherine Marsh, rebuilding her reputation one honest transaction at a time. About Leo Garrison, sitting in a cell wondering if the money had been worth the ruin of his name. And I thought about Nero Wolfe, the genius in the custom-made chair, who moved through the world of crime without ever leaving his house, solving puzzles not because he cared about abstract justice, but because disorder offended his sense of aesthetics. He was the ultimate authentic article, a man who had constructed a world that fit him perfectly and refused to compromise it for anyone. Fritz announced dinner was ready. Wolfe closed his book, marked his place with thin gold leather, and rose from his chair. He looked at me, his eyes clear and sharp. The eyes of a man who sees everything and is surprised by nothing. "Satisfactory," he said. For Nero Wolfe, that was the highest praise there was. We walked into the dining room together, leaving shadows and secrets behind in the office, ready to sit down and enjoy the only things that really mattered. Good food, good drink, and the enduring satisfaction of being right. The brownstone on West 35th Street stood against the night, a fortress of logic in a chaotic city, and inside, everything was exactly where it was supposed to be.